All right, this is our first set of notes for Unit 4. This is notes on reproduction with cones and flowers. This is going in your lecture notebook, and this will just be behind your CK12 readings. If you haven't already, make sure to grab the handout that you're filling in as you go. And then don't forget also to have audio, so that, or at least captions, so you can jot down things that are said but not necessarily on the slide. These notes are also going to be especially useful for your flower dissection, which is going to be tomorrow. So do make sure when it comes to that part, you're taking care to add the labels to all the parts of the flowers as we go to use as a reference. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. So remember that all plants have this alternation of generations, where there's a sporophyte generation where it's diploid or diploid, and then you have a haploid gametophyte generation. So remember, gametophytes are going to be where a plant in its form as a gametophyte produces these haploid cells, sperm cells and egg cells. That can be used for reproduction. Okay, so in gymnosperms, like conifers and cycads and ginkgos and so on, these gametophytes are found inside of cones, like this pine cone that you see right here. Pine is a conifer. In angiosperms, they're found inside flowers, like this gladiolus that we see here. So both of these different structures, cones and flowers, represent two different methods of reproduction. They do, however, have a lot of similarities as well. So, when it comes to the fact that there is a sperm cell and an egg cell, or sperm cells, I should say, and egg cells that are made in these reproductive structures. And it's in some shape or form they're going to come together to be able to produce a fertilized zygote that'll grow into a sporophyte one day. Okay, ultimately both of them, whether cone or flower, are still seed-bearing plants. It's just the place where these seeds are housed, whether cones or flowers, are different depending on whether we're talking about gymnosperm or angiosperm. Okay, so let's start with gymnosperms. These are where cones are involved. Okay, so gymnosperms produce actually a couple of different types of cones, and they're produced by the mature diploid or diploid sporophyte plant. Okay, so most of our examples in this set of slides are going to be conifers like pine. So here you can see that there we go, two types of cones. There are pollen cones, and they're usually smaller. They don't, their scales are actually very small as well. These are some as well. These are pollen cones. And then you have the larger and more commonly recognized type of cones, which are the seed cones that you see here, okay? So I know it's not listed on here, but you should probably add it in. Pollen cones, since they produce pollen, which contain the male gametophytes, or male gametes, these are considered the male. And the seed cones, which contain the seeds, ovules, these are the female. Okay, so pollen cones produce male gametophytes, called pollen grains, also known as pollen grains. These are some pollen grains really, really zoomed in for you to see them up close, but really to the naked eye, they just look like little specks, almost like dust. That's how tiny they are. Okay, so remember that these are haploid. That's why we have just the letter N to represent their genetic material. So that means they only have half of the normal amount of genetic material, much like a sperm cell would have in an animal. Okay, seed cones produce the female gametophytes. And so what you're seeing here is actually one of those scales from a seed cone. And if ever you've picked up a pine cone before and kind of tried to look in between those scales, you can often find seeds in them. And usually there are two with every scale. So you can imagine, I'm just going to go back here a second. You can imagine which in each of these little gaps on top of, like here's the top of the cone, here's the bottom, you would find maybe two, up to two seeds that could be fertilized and create a, create a fertilized seed that could be used to grow an adult plant. Okay, so the pollination process does actually take, with gymnosperms, it actually takes about 2 years, mainly because once a seed is fertilized, it's going to take some time for that seed to grow old enough as a sporophyte to be able to make the different types of cones. Okay, but let's kind of look up top here. If you want a labeled diagram of this, if you go to page 611 of the textbook, it has it there. But I'm just giving you the gist of it. And if you need that detail, you're welcome to go there. But here you can see the female cones that have the ovules. Here you can see the pollen cones that would contain the pollen. Okay, so this is actually just zooming in on one of these, what's happening inside of these ovules that you can see right here. Okay, so there's a bunch of meiosis that happens in this part of the life cycle. So in this ovule, you have the development of female haploid cells. But in any case, here's the pollen, and you have the ovule. They come together. Fertilization happens when they come together, and then you end up with a zygote. So that is where the diploid phase starts. And so this zygote eventually will turn into a seed. And remember, a seed has that embryo, okay, so that baby plant that will eventually develop into an adult, as well as you have a seed coat surrounding it. It's not a very, when it comes to gymnosperms, they have naked seeds, so it's not like they're really, really well protected, but they do have a seed coat, and then they have something, they have an endosperm as well there, okay, which will hopefully nourish that seed. But in any case, once that seed is able to sprout, then it'll turn into hopefully an adult, a mature sporophyte, seedling to sporophyte, and then that's where it might take a bit of time for it to get to the age where it can produce cones, and then we have the cycle starting all over again. Okay, so that's with gymnosperms. Now with angiosperms, the reproductive organs are those flowers. Okay, so every flower, you can see there's a wide variety of like petals, colors, length of, even when it comes to the centers of them where the reproductive organs are, there's a lot of variety there, but ultimately all flowers have the same 4 kinds of specialized leaves. You have sepals, petals, stamens, and carpels. So we're going to point out those parts when we look at the parts of a flower. Okay, now you're going to see the next few slides are the same in terms of their image, but the labels are going to change. So do make sure, in addition to writing down what they do, that you're also filling in those labels, since these next few slides are going to be especially important for your dissection tomorrow. Okay, so let's start with the sepals. These green kind of leaf-like structures are sepals, and what they do is when this flower is developing and is a bud before it actually blossoms into a flower, these sepals are like an outer covering or outer protective layer. And then once that flower blooms, they kind of they don't really serve much purpose at that point. And you can see them kind of just on the side here. But they don't produce any sort of reproductive cells or anything like that. They're mostly just protective while the flower is developing. Okay, here are petals. Okay, so they're usually very brightly colored. They're found just inside of the sepals. Okay, and their main purpose is to provide some way of attracting a pollinator to the flower. Okay, um, because sepals and petals, neither of them produce any sort of reproductive cells themselves, they're often called sterile leaves. But they're still important because they house where all the reproduction takes place, which is all these yellow structures that you see in the middle. Okay, now a flower has male and female parts. Okay, so in terms of the male parts, that's actually these structures right here. Okay, these are called stamens, and they're made up of two parts. There are anthers and filaments. So the anthers are the darker orange, darker yellow kind of tops that you see. And then the filaments are those thin stalks that they're attached to. So let's look at anthers first. These are responsible for making pollen. So they're kind of the main male reproductive organ. Okay, so so they'll produce pollen, and that pollen kind of coats the outer surface of these anthers. Okay, and so the meiosis that takes place to produce many pollen grains, many male gametes, it takes place within these anthers. Okay, now these are only as useful as they're only really useful if that pollen is going to be picked up by a pollinator to be taken to another flower. So the filaments support the anthers and kind of hold them in a place where when a pollinator comes, to drink nectar from the flower, they'll rub up against these anthers on top of these filaments and get coated with the pollen to carry it away. Okay, inside of that, almost like a ring of stamens, you have this right here, this carpel, also known as a pistil, is the female reproductive organ of the flower. Okay, and it's made up of three parts. You have a stigma, which is this top part right here. You have the style, and then you have the ovary, which is down here. And this is actually the main female reproductive organ. Think of anything, the stigma and style are just like a pathway or a conduit to get pollen to here where fertilization actually does happen. Okay, also you might want to add these in. I just realized now I don't think I have them on the slide. The stigma, its function is it's actually kind of sticky. And so when a pollinator comes by or brushes up against it, that stickiness tends to trap pollen grains, and then that will allow that pollen to be able to get down to the ovary. And that's actually what the style is. It's just like a channel, basically, or a tube to get the pollen that lands here to get down here. Okay, sometimes it even stores pollen grains as well. Okay, at the base of each carpel or pistil is an ovary. So this large structure here is the ovary, and inside of it there are several ovules. So there's 6 that we're showing right here, and it's in these ovules that the female gametophytes are produced, and eventually fertilization is going to take place. Okay, so here are all those parts together. I don't believe you have this slide. I'm not sure. To save room, I'm going to see if I can leave this in. But if not, it's just a combination of all of the other diagrams that all the parts that we've kind of looked at. Okay, all right. So usually a typical flower has both male and female gametophytes, right? Because we have the male gametophytes being produced here in the stamens, in the anthers, and then the female gametophytes are being produced here in the ovary, in the ovules. Okay, however, there are some plants where there are male and female gametophytes produced separately. So some plants have male flowers and female flowers. I think peas are a good example of that. But usually angiosperms will at least have male and female gametophytes relatively close together, like at least on the same plant, so that pollination is more likely to happen. Okay, so yeah, pollination happens. Reproduction happens within the flower. So usually what ends up happening is pollination, fertilization, and then eventually the seeds that will, if they are able to sprout, will eventually grow into a sporophyte. Okay, also I should probably point out the pathway. You might want to jot it down. So well, actually, I kind of mentioned it already. But in any case, when pollination happens, usually these flowers will have things like nectar or even the bright colors of the petals, but something to attract a pollinator to be able to get far into this flower. Usually nectar is like right around here, right around here. If you imagine a hummingbird or a bee would have to climb deep into this flower, by doing so rubs up against all of these anthers, or some of these anthers, and picks up pollen. And then when it goes on to the next plant, the next flower or plant, and also drinks some of the nectar from this area here, it's going to very likely brush against the stigma. And so that pollen ends up traveling down the style and then will cause, and will, male gametes will meet female gametes, and you have fertilization happening here. Okay, all right. Lastly, I just want to go over pollination really quickly in terms of the different types. Okay, so wind pollination is something that is more common with gymnosperms. There are a couple of angiosperms that use wind pollination, but it's really not very, it's not usually done by them. It's mostly gymnosperms, okay? It's not very efficient. Obviously, you're kind of relying on chance there for the wind to blow in just the right direction that gets pollen to seed cones. Also, it does rely quite heavily on weather, not only for wind to be able to blow pollen in the right direction, but also, if there's rain or things like that, it can prevent pollen from meeting its destination and washing a lot of pollen away. So there's a lot of chance. It's not ideal, which is why most gymnosperms, when their pollen cones release pollen, they release a ton of it. And there are some seed cones that will produce like a sticky sap to hopefully trap some of the pollen that flies by on the wind, but again, not very efficient. Animal pollination is primarily angiosperms. So flowers rely on, plants with flowers rely on hummingbirds and various insects to be able to carry the pollen from one flower to another. And so plants will employ things like using bright colors to attract animals or insects, tempting them with nectar, as a food source, to be able to get animals to pollinate them. And so ultimately you end up having this kind of mutual relationship. The plants benefit because they get sperm cells, male gametes towards female gametes, and, reproduction. But animals get food sources. So that's a long-standing mutual relationship. Okay, and that is it. Thanks.